whatever your name is, whoever's listening right now, if you were to get a letter in the mail saying not that you've been selected as a jury member, please report to jury duty, but you've been selected as a member of parliament, please report to Ottawa for the next 5 years, I would trust you. I've never met you. I don't even know your name, but I would trust you with that more than the people who are in there now. And I think you would do a better job. And I think we'd all be better off for it.
My name is Ben Charland. You're listening to What on Earth is Going On. My guest this week is Dave Meslin, community organizer, activist, and author based out of Toronto. He's written a book recently called Teardown, Rebuilding Democracy from the Ground Up. And when I read this book, found it provocative and fascinating, full of insight, not only about our democracy and our politics, but about how we seem to govern ourselves. Moreover, the book provides real solutions. It doesn't just pose the questions, it tries to answer them. And when I read this book, I knew that I wanted to get Dave on the podcast. Now, in this conversation, we talk about many things, such as populism and the multiple sides of populism, Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, Brexit. But on the other side, the willingness and the desire for people to be involved and to participate in their system, and why that might actually be better than having the elites do it. We talk about how we replicate medieval power structures in our society and in our politics, and the power of tradition versus innovation. In other words, why is it that our government institutions want to replicate and model themselves on the past, whereas, say, a corporation is very comfortable not just innovating, but showing that innovation in their boardroom? Towards the end of the conversation, Dave actually speaks directly to you, the listener, and asks what would happen if you got a letter in the mail. But instead of jury duty, this letter was asking you to report for a different kind of duty, to be a member of parliament, or to be a member of Congress, to be a member of the legislature for your city, your province or state, or your country. Would it be any worse than what we currently have? And in fact, could it be better? It's a fascinating question, and one I think that is at the heart of Dave's work. Now, if you like this episode and this podcast, please do me a favor. First, spread the word, and second, give it a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or on whatever podcast provider that you use. You can also go to the website, whatonearthisgoingon.ca, to listen to all previous episodes and to get in touch with me on Facebook, Instagram, you name it. I'd love to hear your questions and your solutions in line with what Dave talks about in this week's episode. As always, let me know what on earth you think is going on. Dave Meslin, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
I'm really excited to have you on. There's a lot I want to talk to you about, and there's one thing I want to say before we get started, which is that I'm asking this question of people, what on earth is going on? And I often look for people who have an explanation in a book form or research that they do or in the work that they do, and they're constantly grappling with this question, what on earth is going on? You do that as well, but when I read your book, Teardown, I realized that you're not just giving an explanation, you're giving remedies. In fact, 100 remedies for what on earth is going on with our democracy, with our social life, with our civics. And for that reason, I'm more excited to talk with you than I usually am, because we often miss the solutions. We're often not just complaining, but talking about what's wrong. And we're missing the chance to explain the alternative. Because if we tear down in one of the 3 ways we can tear something down that's in your book, if we just tear everything down but don't have a replacement, we're in deep shit.
Yeah.
So, Dave, here's the question. What on earth is going on?
Yeah, well, I think you kind of nailed it right there in your question. I think there's a lot of awareness that the world around us is not a reflection of what we're capable of in terms of the way we're treating the planet, the way we treat each other, just the level of discourse. I mean, the easiest example is the Canadian House of Commons, where you've got these politicians bickering and kind of heckling each other and acting in a really childish way. And I think a lot of us just kind of, at best, roll our eyes. At worst, I mean, it's actually kind of scary to think that this sacred space where these really important people who are making really important decisions are acting in a way that in any other workplace would probably get you fired. Yeah. I mean, that's actually kind of scary. But you nailed it when you said we often don't talk about what the solutions are. And let me kind of disagree there. It's not that we don't talk about it, it's that we get distracted by fake solutions. So we often assume, oh, I just need to elect this guy or get behind this party and everything's going to be fine. So I can tell you there's a lot of people who think the solution is electing Bernie Sanders. And there's a bunch of people who think the solution was electing Donald Trump. And in fact, I start out the book by pointing out that they're actually very similar candidates. And I offer quotes from both Sanders and Trump, and from the Occupy movement and the Tea Party, and I challenge the reader to tell me which is which, because I think a lot of us know deep in our core that power has become concentrated in the hands of a small group of elite insider players, which again, that could be Trump talking or Bernie Sanders. But you don't fix it by electing some guy who's either a rich billionaire himself or a career politician who are pretty much saying, I've got the answers. If you elect me, I'll just fix it all.
Right. And I really appreciate what you're saying because, I mean, there's this word populism that's used a lot, and you talk about populism a lot. The first episode of this podcast was titled Populism, and I was talking to a professor at Queen's University who studies populism specifically in the Canadian context and specifically to do with multiculturalism and how Canada's populist movements have been different from the American ones because we seem to be inoculated against xenophobia because of how Canadian culture works. That's not totally true, but it doesn't affect our political sphere as much as it does in the United States.
Sure.
But what you've said is that instead of just coming out against populist resentment and anger, redirect that and use that and appreciate that this is coming from somewhere genuine. I mean, something else that you've said is that we should overcome the fear of calling our system broken and rigged, because it is.
It is. And if we're not prepared to acknowledge that, it creates a political vacuum that someone like Trump will happily walk into. I can't think of anyone who's like, especially not in Canada, a prominent progressive leader who is stating that the system is broken and needs to be redesigned, and offering a plan of how to do that. But to go back to populism, the problem lies not just in how we view the problem or the issue, but the use of the word itself. The word literally just means like ruling in the interests of people, which is a really good thing. Like it's almost synonymous with the word democracy. Like it's just about people power. It's rage against the machine as populism.
I remember when I first read that word in like a history class when I was in university or high school or something and went, oh, populism, that sounds good.
Sounds great.
My first reaction was, it was something about populist parties in Alberta or something and how that was different in Canada. And I thought, oh, so how could you be in a democracy and then have a popular movement that's against the establishment? Does that mean it's not a democracy? And then, of course, we spin into the academia into it. But it's a fascinating discussion.
It really, so someone like Trump will use the word elite a lot. And I think so will Sanders. And that really bothers a lot of folks who are, part of kind of an insider's game. So the word populism, the way we use it now, these days, is to describe kind of knee-jerk, often far right-wing, closed-minded, often racist, xenophobic movements. To use the word populism to describe that is to suggest that people, at their core, are terrible, and that democracy fails us when we appeal to people's genuine interests. But what a terrible thing to suggest. I mean, it goes against the idea of having a democracy in the first place. You're providing an argument for fascism.
And yet people aren't afraid of saying that. I've heard people on this podcast have talked about this. I've found myself saying this. That and one thing that you say is the importance of trust and recognizing that the inherent humanity and intelligence of our fellow human being, and that we have to trust that a person knows what they're doing and what they're talking about. And if you put them in the room with 20 other people to make up big decisions, they will get serious and they will be thoughtful as anybody else, even if they're not experts in that. Doesn't mean they have to be an expert, but it's tempting sometimes to say the people who are stupid in this world just shouldn't be allowed to participate because we know what's better for them.
Especially when we think most people are stupid, which is, again, what the word populism kind of implies. That the general public is kind of ignorant and mean.
And that's not an uncommon view.
So it's scary to think that politicians might start appealing to the masses, because we can't trust the masses. I mean, that is literally the argument in favor of not having a democracy. And, so it's very frightening to me. I talk about kind of declaring war on cynicism in the book, and I describe in the introduction that cynicism is flowing right now in 3 directions, and they're all problematic, and they're all kind of dangerous. One is we've become very cynical of governments, which is well-deserved, I think, at this point, but it's not something we want to... It's something we should want to fix. Governments, I think, have become very cynical about the general public. But the most dangerous one is that I think there's a cynicism just we have amongst each other. I think we've lost faith in ourselves and in our neighbors and in what the average person is capable of achieving.
Why do you think that is? Why has that happened?
It's a good question. I haven't been alive long enough to know whether it's kind of a newish thing or an oldish thing. If you think about it, most of human history has been, very top down, and that was tied to religion. There was this idea of like divine right, like the kings ruled because God wanted them to. That's a pretty good way to build a low sense of self-confidence amongst the masses that
sure.
God's chosen this other guy and he's going to make decisions for you. It's almost it's an infantilization of humanity, that we all need a dad to take care of us. I think we still embrace that culturally and spiritually to the point where, let's be honest, we frequently and increasingly so elect the male lineage of prior leaders. Even though we're allowed to vote for anyone we want, we're actually replicating medieval power structures by saying, well, that guy 20 years ago was a pretty cool leader, let's just go with his kid. And the degree to which we do that at all 3 levels of government, the numbers are astounding.
Yeah, I think you've said that 120 people in the House of Commons have sat next to their brother, and 0 have sat next to their sister.
That's right.
And, of course, we have the son of a former prime minister, now the prime minister, and we can go on and on and on.
We could. I live in Ontario. Doug Ford is my premier. He's sitting in a legislature that his father sat in. Just down the road, his brother sat as the mayor. When his brother became the mayor, Doug himself became the councillor. When Doug vacated the seat, his nephew, not his niece, his nephew took over the seat, Mike Ford. And Mike Ford sits a few seats away from Mike Layton, who is now also not second but third generation political family. So it's not just the right wing or the left wing, it's right across the board. And within that room, you've got the Cole family, you've got the Holiday family, you've got the Cressy family. I mean, it's staggering.
And, one thing you've said about this, too, is that we seem to still live in a monarchy, that the prime minister wields monarchical power, even if it's framed in a democratic legitimacy. And what's interesting about that is that you mentioned religion, too. I think that there is a certain religion around democracy. I think there is a certain religion around our institutions and the tradition of it, that there's a civic duty that we have to vote, and there's a sense of religion when we go into the great halls of Parliament or Congress in the United States or in the United Kingdom. These are powerful places, and they're exclusive, too. This is something you've written about where, I think it was Halifax City Hall where you can't find the door into it.
Yeah.
I think that's partly because they're meant to be so-called sacred, and I think that a civic religion has taken over from some of the vacuum that actual religion has left. But we're living now in a place where we think it's one thing, but in fact it's something else. We think that we're living in a free democratic society, but in fact the actual use of power, and power I think is the real nub here, is exercised differently.
Yeah, so I'm really careful with how I talk about this particular angle, because I don't want to sound naive or delusional to suggest that what we have now resembles medieval times. We have freedom of the press, we have an independent judiciary, we have so many things to be really excited about and proud of, and things that keep us safe.
And the rule of law and the fact that,
Yeah, so obviously we're not living in medieval times. That said, the degree to which our actual decision-making processes do resemble culturally what we had, 600-700 years ago, is staggering. And the three specifics that I could mention here is centralization of power, and of course, the king of old times was the ultimate expression of that. One guy on a throne, he's in charge. And I have a graph in the book where I show how, starting from the Magna Carta and onwards, we as a society said, well, maybe instead of one dude sitting on a chair, there should be like rooms full of people who talk to each other. We'll probably get better policy outcomes and less likely that someone will be tyrannical. So we created councils and houses, legislatures, congresses, and it was all about shifting pointy power to rounded power, that if you drew an image of what this shape of power looks like, it doesn't end with one person. There's a group. And what I suggest in the book is that we've actually devolved as a species, and we've returned to a decision-making model that is very singular. So in the Canadian context, that means that power in the last 40 years has become incredibly concentrated in the office of the Prime Minister. The degree to which members of Parliament have their votes whipped and are told what to do every day, what to say, what to think, how to vote, it really raises a serious question. Do we have a legislative branch? Do we have a room where people come together to share ideas, listen to each other, vote with their conscience, vote on behalf of their ridings? No, we really don't. And this isn't a conspiracy theory. This is like members of Parliament are telling us this.
Yeah.
After they, especially if they're retiring and they're being interviewed on their experience, they're saying, well, I didn't really have a role or a job. And in fact, when I did speak in the House, I was being told to heckle and yell, and what they're telling us that they feel embarrassed at the way they behaved. So number one, centralization of power. Another characteristic of medieval times was that guy sitting on the throne didn't require a mandate. He or she, there were queens, of course, could rule against the will of the majority, which sounds absurd now. Well, we have a democracy. No one could rule in our name if most of us didn't want them to. Yet that's exactly what our voting system does. So first past the post. In most of our elections, especially a lot of recent ones, literally delivers a mathematical outcome that is the opposite of what people wanted. I could use Ontario right now as an example. And to be clear, I'm not partisan on this. I have a website called Lego My Vote, and I show distortions that our voting system produces. And if Doug Ford gets elected with the fake majority, I call it out. If Justin Trudeau gets elected with the fake majority, I call that out. And if Rachel Notley gets elected with the fake majority, I call that out. So in the last Ontario election, the Conservatives put forward a platform. Most Ontarians didn't vote for it. They didn't like it. They didn't want it. And not only did they win the election, they won a majority government. And then the third characteristic of medieval times was that these folks were often part of a family line. So if you were to describe medieval times as a situation where people ruled kind of unilaterally with complete control over a legislature through centralized power within a single office, able to rule against the will of the majority, and often within the context of family lineage, that sounds very familiar to me.
Is there ever a case in which it's okay for power to rule against the majority? For example, in protection of a minority right?
Yeah, although, so we have this idea of, three branches of government, and it's the judicial branch, the courts, that are there as the real safety check for that. If a government tried to pass legislation that discriminated against a certain group and violated their rights, the government can be taken to court.
Right.
The real, more important question to have is, do we still... I introduced this acronym SLAG, and it stands for that the single leader annihilates the group. And what I mean by that is when philosophers back in the day were trying to figure out what different government structure should look like, they came up with this idea of separation of powers. And keep in mind, what they were trying to do was create something to replace a monarchy, something that had more responsiveness, had more safety mechanisms, that wasn't tyrannical. So they thought there needs to be power in different bodies that can act as a check on each other. And the judicial branch is amazing and so important. And we're seeing it used really well in the United States, and it's been used really well here in Canada as well. But the other two branches are the legislative and the executive. And this is a model that was written about and hypothesized centuries ago. And no one's really questioned whether it needs to be updated. I mean, it was written before we had electricity, before we had, like, anything.
Yeah.
And, I feel like in every sector of our lives, we're, like, all about innovation and disruption. And it's like, let's try new things. And in government, we're just like, I call it that we assume that the primary aesthetic of politics should be tradition, that it should look the way it looked to our grandparents. And that's why if you go into a corporate boardroom, it'll be really new and cool. If you go to Google's corporate headquarters, they're all about, like, we've got ping pong tables and we've got whiteboards. Yeah. You go into the House of Commons and it's like, look, we haven't changed anything in 150 years. Isn't that cool?
In fact, we promise we haven't changed anything because you'll freak out if we have.
Yeah.
And I think that Google and Facebook and any corporation, there's an incentive for them to innovate. There's an incentive for them to build their brand. There's an incentive, I think, for government in our system, or in any system, to achieve legitimacy. And one way to achieve legitimacy is through tradition and through, obviously, the feeling that they're reflecting the popular will. But one clear theme of your work is not only that tradition is the barrier, or one of the main barriers, but also that there's no desire on behalf of those in power to let people in. I mean, there's just no interest. Why would you?
It's a conflict of interest in a way.
Right, and that was, so I worked in politics for a while. I worked in Ottawa for about a year and a half and experienced this firsthand. And I was disillusioned throughout with the process, and I didn't come in feeling like I would be excited and inspired by it, and I was confirmed in my belief. Because it doesn't, if I'm speaking of a we, when we're in power, we don't want you to send us emails. We don't want you to phone.
Right.
We don't want you to send your engagement. We'll engage with you to say that we've engaged. We have no interest in this process because we've already decided what we want to do. What we want to do, though, also is to do a poll to find out what people want so that we can at least win the election and then stay in power for another 4 years.
Which you can do with only 40% of the vote. So
and you only need 40% of the vote, or 35%.
So this is why I wrote the book, because if any of these changes that need to happen, it won't be because politicians prioritized it. It'll be because the level of public awareness that other ways of doing this exist, and then people rose up and pushed for it. That's why it'll happen. So to go back to this thing about the branches, the legislative and executive branch theory is so ancient, and I think so out of date. And I think what we've seen is that it's proven not to work. And the idea was that there'd be two branches. The legislative would be a collective body of people who would come together and legislate. They would be the main body. You can look at all the different writings about this, and it's very clear that they were supposed to be kind of supreme. That there was this idea that if the legislative body decided that garbage needs to get picked up on Wednesdays, someone needs to make sure it actually gets picked up. Someone has to execute the will of the legislators. Like, it's almost like a managerial role. We'll call that the executive branch. They're just going to get shit done. And it's funny how now we associate the word executive with, like, power and importance, the executive office, the executive suite. It comes from the word execute, and literally not executing what you want to do, executing the will of the people who are in power, which isn't you.
Yeah, it's fascinating because to execute to bring you your tea or your coffee, to execute the delivery of the garbage and the paying of that person.
Yeah.
Most people don't want to be an office manager. They want to be the CEO. Right? They want to be the person in power making decisions, strategizing. But the office manager is the person making sure that there's paper in the printer. That's not a sexy job.
The executive branch was the office manager. And the word president came from who was going to preside over the execution. So you got the legislators saying garbage should get picked up on Wednesdays. And then you had the executive branch saying, we'll get that done. And they were like, someone should be in charge of that. Someone should preside over the execution.
Well, and you've mentioned before that the framers of the U.S. Constitution actually thought of having 3 presidents or 3 people occupying that executive position.
Yeah, there was a vote on it, and it came close to passing. You know, some very significant states, I forget which ones, but when they had their founding conference, the representatives from major states voted in favor of that. And the reason is they had just overthrown a king. And their whole mindset was, how do we make sure we create a system where no one could ever feel like a king or be seen as a king or resemble a king? And so they thought, well, we can't have one person in charge of the executive branch. That'll totally look like a king. And in the end, what they decided is that there would be one person in charge, wouldn't be elected by the people. The reason they created the Electoral College is so the president wouldn't be directly elected, because if the people directly elected a single leader, that person is kind of like a king now, right? So they were like, okay, we'll have the people elect like a third legislature, sort of. So we'll have the Senate, the House of Representatives, and we'll have this third group, the Electoral College. They'll pick a president
and they can thwart the will of the people if the people choose. Because one of the chief anxieties of the framers of the Constitution was mob rule.
Yeah.
They said, okay, we don't want tyranny anymore, but we also don't want to devolve into anarchy. We want to have something in the middle. And they were quite afraid of popular mob rule. And one of the ways they did that, of course, was the Electoral College.
Yeah.
But I wonder, I want to talk about citizen assemblies, and I want to talk a lot about the innovations that you've written about and talk about a lot. But before we do, I just have a question that I was thinking about a few minutes ago, which is there a possibility that some of, like SLAG, the single leader annihilating the group, that we look to these celebrity leaders, we look to reality TV stars to lead countries, these singular people, these heroes, this mythology of having heroes lead us. Is there something inherent in our nature as human beings that we crave that, and therefore should that be therefore necessarily built into our politics? I
think we do crave it. I mean, it's our history. So all of our collective cultural tales have that hero. Whether it's Moses or Jesus, or Neo in the Matrix, or Harry Potter. Like, you can go back 5 years or go back 5,000 years. It's in our DNA that we will be saved by a great leader. And these days, the person who is, holding up that staff and saying, I will, split the Red Sea for you and guide us to the Holy Land. For some people, it's Bernie Sanders. For some people, it's Donald Trump. For some people, it was Jack Layton. These people, cultivate a cult-like status.
To be fair, it's Justin Trudeau for some people.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And again, this is why the family stuff becomes important, because in a lot of these stories,
the father. Star Wars, Luke Skywalker.
Oh my God. Yeah. Harry Potter, there was a thing about his dad, and he was a kid and got the cross on his forehead. Like, it's all about who you were when you were born, right? Even the new Star Wars, it's all like, oh, whose kid is whose, right? So we're not going to get that out of our cultural DNA. This is why I coined the term SLAG, because what we've learned is that when we create a legislative body and a singular executive branch, culturally we associate power with the singular branch, even though that was not the intent when these ideas were developed centuries ago. So if you have a council and a mayor, people tend to think about the mayor more.
Well, and they have no idea who their councillor is.
Yeah, and when the media is covering the election, it's all about, and especially in a country like Canada, where we have, on purpose, weak mayor systems. Like in Toronto, the mayor has one vote. That's it. Council can ignore the mayor any day. And it's not like a federal government where that's seen as a vote of non-confidence and it's a crisis. It's no problem. Any councillor can put forward a motion and win that vote with or without the mayor. That's how the system's supposed to work. The mayor, again, is supposed to just kind of fulfill this idea that there should be an executive branch. But we've explicitly created a system that council is supreme. Yet culturally, as you said, everyone knows who their mayor is. We have a House of Commons where the legislature is supposed to be supreme, but it's all become about the prime minister. And in the U.S. model, the president isn't really supposed to have much power at all. In fact, the first 10 presidents, on average, wrote one executive order per year. And now they'll do one a day. It was supposed to be created so if there was a crisis that needed urgent, immediate attention and Congress wasn't sitting, the president could deal with it. It wasn't supposed to be that whatever they feel like doing, like, oh, I want to have a wall, I want to ban this country or ban that country, I want to pull out of this accord. Like, that was not the idea. So I coined the term slag because I think we need to reevaluate whether we still should have an executive branch, because I think we've proven that we're not capable of having an executive branch while maintaining the supremacy or even the relevancy of the legislative branch. And I kind of tongue-in-cheek, but kind of seriously ask, why does a council need a mayor? Why does a legislature need a prime minister? Why does Congress also need a president? And the simplest one to look at is a council, because, I mean, the histories of Congress and the Westminster model in Ottawa go way back. But let's look at a city like Toronto. I live in Toronto. We have a city council. Any of them, and there's committees. So, you know, you have a committee about transportation, a committee about parks. They could choose amongst themselves who sits on which committee. Each committee could elect their own chair. The chair of that committee could set an agenda. Any councillor can bring forward a motion. They debate. They vote at council using Robert's rules or whatever. Why would you need another office called the mayor who's also kind of in charge? It's actually really confusing. It's like, well, wait a minute. Who's in charge?
And is it partly because we just, as human beings, want that? Like you mentioned cultural DNA. Is it deep? Is it just our DNA? Like, a lot of people have argued that storytelling is one of the fundamental unifying principles of our species. And in storytelling, you have the hero story, as we were just talking about. And is part of it just this need that I can't, as a human being, understand every day this abstract idea of a council and these 12 people sitting in a room? It doesn't make as much sense to me as just one person. Oh, Joe. I know Joe. Joe makes sense to me. I can trust Joe. Joe's on posters and billboards, and I'll vote for Joe. 12 people or 100 people or citizen assemblies all across the country, that's too abstract. Unless, of course, I'm an expert in it.
It's confusing.
It's confusing.
It is more confusing. But let me give you a simple example. You know, a few generations back, there was an idea that the man was in charge of the house. The man, you know, wore the pants or whatever. And the
woman was in the kitchen. And
yeah.
The whole, yeah.
And, you know, you could argue, well, that was a lot simpler, right? Like, no one needed to have a discussion about household budget decisions or this or that.
It was a fait accompli. It was accepted.
Yeah, it was accepted. And there's still certain subcultures or religious groups that still embrace that model. But for the most part, most of us, I think, gravitate towards a different view of how a family works. And a couple, whether same-sex or otherwise, that they talk to each other about the family, and they make decisions together. Well, that's more abstract, that's more complicated, that's more confusing. But I think most of us see it as just an obvious evolution of our species, that we've come to realize that we all should treat each other more equally. So it would be a cultural shift. And again, what I'm proposing is that the only way we can do it is by just getting rid of the mayor. I don't think we could create a situation where we elect a mayor, but everyone also at the same time has a heightened awareness that their councillor is just as powerful or should be just as powerful. Number one, that's confusing. But number two, it's just really old-fashioned. So what I did in the book is I went back and researched all the reasons why they thought you needed a third branch. Like, why wouldn't you just have two branches? A legislative branch and then a judicial branch to keep an eye on it and to make sure they aren't trampling over people's rights or just, you know, seizing tyrannical power, changing the rules in their own interest. Why was there a third branch? And I found 4 or 5 different reasons, and I kind of break them down. And I playfully, you know, suggest that none of those reasons actually apply anymore. Some of them, so one thing was that, you know, I mean, again, like, not only was this pre-internet, it was pre-electricity. Like, nothing that we have now was imaginable then. So one idea was that there should be someone who's just kind of keeping an eye on them, because if a legislature voted on, like, changing election rules, that we have now a 20-year term instead of a 3-year term, like no one would even know, right? It's the idea of having like another house, you know, or an executive branch kind of down the road was really important, that someone with power was keeping an eye on them all the time. But, I mean, that's not how the legislature works now. We're live tweeting every vote, every debate. You know, you don't need that kind of second set of eyes just to be around, because no one would know otherwise.
An interesting concept that came up earlier in this conversation is how pointy power, say of a monarchy, can become rounded power, and in fact has become rounded power over time. But have we gone backwards? Have we turned rounded power back into the pointed power of, say, a prime minister or a president? Now, coming up in this conversation, Dave argues quite persuasively that paying taxes can actually be cool. To find out what he means by that, keep listening to What on Earth is Going On. Do you think that there's an appetite, as well as the, I guess, technological opportunity, to have more direct democracy, where I'm individually participating in the decisions that are currently being undertaken and ruled by legislators in the House of Commons, for example? Yeah.
So I'm going to give you a messy answer to this.
Love messy answers because they can go anywhere.
Yeah, so the topic we were just talking about, the chapter there is called End of Heroes, and I'm actually pretty clear on what my position is, which is that all decision-making should be collective, in groups, without a centralized executive role, and we are capable of that as a species, and it might require professional facilitators to help us talk to each other, but the power should be shared. It should be round. In terms of direct democracy, that's in the chapter called Taking the Reins. How do we take the reins as ordinary people in between elections? And I want to be careful with this one because I actually really believe in representative democracy. There's a lot of folks out there now pushing ideas that we could replace representative democracy with an app, right? We don't need to have 338 people in Ottawa making decisions on our behalf, because we can all vote all the time. Every bill, we could all just vote yes or no.
Right.
I hate that idea. It assumes that the only measurement of democracy is the number of people participating. So the mathematical equation there is, instead of 338 people voting, it's 30 million. That must be more democratic.
Right.
But if you'll read the book, which you have, you'll know that I talk a lot about how we can shift away from hostile discourse towards meaningful, in-depth, deep democracy with higher levels of emotional intelligence, where people come together in a room and with humility and with an open mind and with eye contact and humor and trust, talk to each other, learn from each other, compromise, and grow together. That can only happen in a physical room. A legislature, to me, or a council chamber is a sacred space. It's a sacred space where we can evolve further as a species and learn how to share power in ways that we've never learned how to do. You can't do that on an app.
Yeah.
So that said, there are lots of opportunities and examples and instances where I think we could be more directly involved. And for example, a simple one is participatory budgeting. I mean, that's just numbers and math. It doesn't have to be a sacred space with a sacred discussion facilitated with humility. There's experiments that started in Brazil and have now spread across South and North America, where part of the annual capital budget is given directly to a neighborhood. And neighbors propose ideas, and they vote and decide what to do with their tax dollars. I think that's really cool. And then, of course, there's a long history of having referendums. The U.S. does this a lot. They call them, what do they call them? Ballot
propositions.
Propositions. So, and we've seen, whether it's gay marriage or legalizing pot, it's often not the legislators leading. It's the people. Sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. But again, the courts are there to make sure that no one's putting forward a proposition saying, let's put this ethnic community in jail. That's not happening. But there are social justice issues around, let's say, abortion or gay rights, which have been put to a vote. And some of those have also ended up in court. We don't have that culture much in Canada, but we used to, especially municipally. I've been researching this. We used to have referendums in Toronto every year on tons of stuff. Some of it was social policy, social justice questions like, should we let women vote? That was a municipal question before it was being explored for Queen's Park or Ottawa. There was a local grassroots effort being like, what do you think? Should we let women vote? But other things too, like should we build another subway station? Why would we just have council? We've seen what happens when council debates it. We've had some real nightmare decision-making happening in the last few years in Ontario with things being done and undone. That's another negative outcome of first past the post. I call it fishtail legislation. So,
like the first year is always undoing what the last guy spent the last 4 years doing.
Which is funny because we're told that first past the post, one of the benefits is stability, and it's the exact opposite. But we had a situation in Toronto where big capital expenditures would go to a vote, and I actually really like that because I think one of the reasons why there's an anti-tax sentiment amongst large segments of the population, like where they see taxes as a cash grab, isn't because people don't like spending money. People love spending money. And that's why they're in debt.
And they especially love spending money when it's scaled, so that my money will go a longer way if all of us pool it together.
Right.
Yeah. We all understand that.
Yeah. I'll give a few dollars to Netflix and everyone else will. And now we have this amazing library of endless movies to watch. That's cool. But if the government said, well, why don't you give us $5 and we'll create that? They're like, oh, give me my money back.
Right. And why is that?
I think it's because they don't have the decision-making power. So people literally love spending money to the point where it's becoming like a problem. They're in debt because they're spending more. People have to hire trash removal companies to get rid of their stuff because they've bought too much. They bought things they didn't actually need. So this idea that people actually just want money in their pocket is ridiculous. People want money because they love spending it. So one way to build a healthier relationship between collective expenditures, which is what governments do. They spend our money on our behalf to create things we want, like fire stations and libraries and healthcare, is to give us more power over how that money is spent. And for example, let's take transit expansion. So transit expansion is always being hindered by the fact that governments don't have the money they need to build the transit systems that we deserve. I think if they just put the question to us and said, listen, we can build a transit system if you want it. This is what it'll cost. And do it the way the private sector does. Like, be like, no money in the first year, pay us over 20 years, 0% down, and we're going to build a new subway line, and this is what it'll cost you over the next 10 years. And when you break it down like that, you see that it's like $5 a year. Okay, and then it's like yes or no. Do you want it? And I know we had a vote like that in the Vancouver mainland,
right?
That failed a few years ago. And so, this is something we need to move towards gradually. There's so much mistrust now and so much cynicism and frustration. I think if you just held a referendum like that tomorrow, everyone would just vote no because no one trusts the government. But I think we can build a culture of trust and a culture of engagement where the government isn't our enemy. It's a reflection of who we are.
There's an interesting dilemma here, though, when we talk about the money of politics, the money of government, being taxpayers, and how over time we're less and less citizens and more taxpayers. That my identity, my relationship to the government is not as a citizen or just as a voter, it's being a taxpayer. And being a taxpayer is my gateway into being a legitimate member of this society. Now, the dilemma comes in many forms. First of all, what if I don't pay tax because I don't have any money? Am I not a citizen anymore? But the other problem is, and it comes hand in hand with rising economic inequality, which is one of the big issues facing the entire planet, let alone Canada or the United States, which is that if we identify with our government just as taxpayers, then we're by definition unequal because people pay different levels of tax. And some people pay so much tax that they build entire highways and bridges, and some people pay tax to pay the salary of 1/4 of a government employee. Well, that inequality in the structure of government has a real issue there, even if it's just perceived, even if I just don't perceive of myself as being as worthwhile or as beneficial a member of society as the guy sitting at the table next to me. And I think that there's a problem there, and it goes hand in hand with also a conversation about civics and an understanding of who and how we should behave in civic life.
Right. Well, that goes back to what you were saying earlier, that there's a conflict of interest for politicians. So if I run a restaurant, I want people to know about the restaurant. I want them to come in. I want them to love it. I want to have high visibility. But as you pointed out, if I'm running a city council, once I'm elected, I kind of want everyone out of my way. You know, if the public shows up, they could just create a headache for me. They're going to speak against my policy ideas. They might get involved and run against me. So it's in my interest for people to be disengaged. I think that approach in the long run backfires, because by being disengaged, that's what builds the mistrust. I don't know my government. They don't seem to care much about me. Why should I trust them with my money?
Right.
Whereas the restaurant, we do trust with our money because we feel respected. So I think we need to be a little careful with this discussion people often have about the word taxpayer, because on the one hand, it oversimplifies democracy to say, well, it's just about collecting our money and we're all just, it's all about pushing numbers around.
And by the way, I think that's part of the reason for the populist backlash, because government became so small and frankly boring about so little, just this transfer of money around, and not about what we should do, but how we should deliver the service,
right,
and how much, what my tax rate should be. These are boring decisions, and then people get frustrated and upset, and they vote for someone like Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, who wants to make big changes and make it exciting again.
Right.
Yeah.
So the flip side, though, of that discussion is that paying taxes is a really important thing, and spending our taxes is really cool. So I don't think we should be shifting away from this idea that we're primarily taxpayers. We should be reclaiming the word, or coming up with a synonymous word. But the idea that we all come together
like
and
stakeholders
chip in money, and then we choose a group of people who will take that money and do stuff for us, because it's our money, and build things that we want for our health, for our safety, for our family, for our kids, for beauty, for art. That's really cool. That's really cool. So I don't think we should shift the discussion away from the monetary nature of what government does, because it is a huge part of it's probably the biggest part of what they do.
It's definitely become the dominant feature of government. When the U.S. Constitution was written and implemented, I mean, obviously money was a very important part of American society, as it always has been, but government had a more moral and civic obligation.
Yeah.
And over time, it's become what people have called managerial democracy.
Yeah.
But I'm really keen on your excitement over how cool it is to spend money. And that actually goes, and I didn't realize.
Look at our table here.
Yeah.
Let's look at what's at our table. So first of all, we decided to meet at a cafe, and we've both spent money. I got a tea. I got a vanilla.
I got a tea as well.
Nice. I've got a iPhone, not the cheapest phone out there, but I was happy to spend more to get this, although I've kept my 6S because it has a headphone jack.
I've got a 6S too, and I've got a great Moleskine notebook, which costs
not the
more
cheapest.
Than
oh my god! You could get a $1 notebook.
I could get 14 of these notebooks for the same price of a different brand.
So why'd you get it?
Because I like it.
Because
it's cool. Because I enjoy it.
Is there any quality difference in the cover and the paper?
Well, not to spend 5 minutes talking about Moleskine.
No, let's do that.
But I actually think there is. So I've used notebooks before, and I've used probably 20 of these and filled them up. Maybe even 30, and they don't break. They don't fall apart.
Okay.
They last a long time.
And then, Ben, more importantly, we're not recording on your phone, are we?
No, we're recording on a Zoom H6 to advertise for them, too.
Nice. So you could have recorded for free on your existing phone.
Absolutely.
Instead, you spent, I'm guessing, more than $20 on that very complex piece of
22.
Digital machinery.
No, yeah, for sure.
22 with a 0 or
and
2
I
after
enjoy
that.
it. And you're absolutely right.
We not only do we like spending money, but we like spending more if we know that there's quality attached to it. So I would love to see, instead of the annual budget process for a city being this thing about, is the mayor going to raise our taxes? Instead, it's city staff putting together 5 different potential budgets, explaining what it would cost us per per citizen. You could log in. It'll be like, well, Ben, this one won't cost you anything more. We're going to keep everything as it is. Here's one where we're going to increase taxes a bit. You'll pay $10 more a month, but your buses will come a little bit faster. We're going to open a new library branch, and we're going to the pools will be open on Sundays. Whatever. Or you could choose this one where we're going to put money back in your pocket. We're going to cut taxes, but this is the actual impact. We won't be able to fix as many potholes. There'll be less police on the street. Whatever. We're going to close a fire station. And just let us decide. And that gets rid of this whole thing about cash grabs, about money being flushed down the toilet. And I think people will actually vote not for the top one, but for they'll vote for an increase. They'll be like, wait, for $10 a month, the bus will come faster.
Like you said with Netflix before,
and with your digital audio recorder, and with my phone, and with your Moleskine, we will always spend more on quality. But we have the choice.
But not just quality, but when we scale it up, we have to spend less to get bigger benefits.
For sure.
It's also network, the network effect of Facebook, for example.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's a whole debate about Facebook that you're not actually a client or a customer of Facebook. Yeah. You're the product that is being sold to the person buying ads on it. But still, I really appreciate your excitement for this, and I totally agree that the two of us sitting at this table, how exciting would it be? I'm not a Torontonian, but I love coming here, and I've come to really enjoy this city, even though I'm from Calgary, so it's in my DNA to despise Toronto. I've come to love it. But if we had 5 different proposals in front of us, you and I, Dave, we could go through it and say, how cool. We could build a whole new subway line, and maybe we could put it over here, and we could think about the 5 million people in the GTA, or 6 or 7, whatever it is now, and think about bettering everyone's lives. That's a cool proposition. But here's the issue that I wanted to raise, and it's often, again, I looked at a lot of talks and dialogues that you've had before, and a lot of the questions that come to you is this question of scale. What happens when we scale it up to that 5 million people or 35 million people? You and I can have a lot of fun. And then if we have a disagreement, we come to make a decision. I accept that the decision was the right one. 35 million Canadians, the question often is can they do that? Even if the majority, 55%, agree with that great budget proposal and they're really excited about it, maybe 20% are livid that has been chosen and morally reprehensible in their minds. And I don't want to just, go down this road of asking you this question about scale because I think you've addressed it before. But it's an important one because there's a difference between you and I getting excited about it and 35 million people or 5 or just 10,000 having to figure this out, because you and I can have this dialogue in the same way that in the House of Commons, one of the solutions you proposed is have different parties randomly sit next to each other. Yeah. So that it's harder for me to get mad at the guy sitting next to me. Yeah. Than if he's across the aisle in this adversarial setting. But that speaks to the point of that's because you can put those people in a room together. And so, I put that question, that whole big mess of a question of scale, right back to you. Yeah, so let me answer it in 2 parts. In terms of whether a policy decision, like how many people will be upset by the outcome of a policy decision, any referendum will produce better results than what we're doing now, because we literally have governments now that are ruling against what most people wanted. So any budget that Doug Ford brings forward now provincially is probably going to piss off a majority of the province, because a majority of us didn't vote for him in the first place. So if we held a referendum instead on budgets, could you end up with 20% who are livid? Yeah, for sure. But right now you could end up with 60% who are livid. But the second part is, you're right. Why does anyone have to be livid? Why does politics have to be this landscape that is dominated by adversarial decision-making, where we assume that groups come together with predetermined ideas and one of them has to beat the other, and that everything is about winners and losers. And heroes. Yeah, and our elections are geared towards winners and losers. And you're right, a referendum is kind of binary, yes or no. So one thing I propose is that our legislatures could be less adversarial, and I propose a whole bunch of ways in the book. As you mentioned, one is just randomizing the seating, which is done in other places. I highlight Iceland, where they literally pull names out of a hat. And the idea is that if all the Liberals in Ottawa are sitting as a mob, they will act like a mob.
and they'll all stand up and clap like trained seals, and they'll heckle the conservatives on the other side of the room.
And vice versa.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. But if you're a liberal sitting with a conservative on your left, a New Democrat on your right, a block in front of you and a green behind you, and you're all looking at photos of your kids or sharing snacks, you can't shift from that to yelling and screaming and heckling, because these are your friends now. But
I wonder, sorry, just a quick tangent. If you did that for, say, 4 years, new groups would form.
Oh,
and perhaps if there would be a whole new block of ideas forming up, because these people simply sit next to each other.
Yeah.
And those mix of ideologies would diminish in favor of you and I, for example, having this conversation. We have this conversation for long enough, we'll start to agree on things and form a twosome against the world.
Yeah, we could co-sponsor legislation, right, from multiple parties. So the party leaders don't want this. The party leaders want their caucus to act like an army that obeys orders. And one way you do that is by sitting as a mob and isolating them from having any human connection to their colleagues. But a referendum, too, doesn't have to be binary. We often, if you think of the Charlottetown Accord or, a lot of the propositions in the U.S., it's always yes and no. But you can actually design a referendum where there's 5 options, where there's a middle ground, where there's ranked choices. So you could say, well, let's just go back to this idea of the 5 budgets. First of all, maybe there's 10 budgets. Maybe you customize the budget. You actually slide. It's a slider. And you're like, well, I'm willing to go up this high as long as I get this. But it doesn't have to be just like yes or no, which is what they did in the Vancouver mainland. It was, should we have a new tax to fund transit expansion? And people voted no, because they just don't trust the government. We've had some referendums recently on voting reform, for example, where instead of saying, okay, should we switch to MMP, yes or no, which is what we did in Ontario, or should we switch to STV, yes or no, which is what we did in BC in 05 and 09. The more recent referendums in both PEI and BC actually gave people a whole bunch of choices. And I think in PEI you were able to rank those choices, which is cool.
Now, is that similar to people not knowing who their councillor is in a council of 20, but they know who the one is? For example, with a ballot measure, which is actually what they're called in the States, not propositions. I remember now, ballot measures. If you have a yes or no, I understand the issue. Even if I'm not really educated on it, I think I get it yes or no. But if there's 6 different options, I don't know. I've heard of SDV before. I'll go for that one. Is there a risk there of making it too complex? And I don't mean to say that people are stupid. But
yeah, and again, I really believe in representative democracy, and I think the most complex issues should be deliberated upon by people in a room. So the interesting middle ground for that is a citizens' assembly. So the best referendum model is that the options you're voting on, whether it's 1 or 5, were created by a deliberative body of your own neighbors. So this is a model that was pioneered in British Columbia in 2004, and it takes the same model we use in courts of law, where we have these juries who have really important role to play. We're putting the lives of defendants, not that we have capital punishment, but are they guilty? Are they innocent? Are they going to go to jail? We put these decisions sometimes in the hands of totally random people who don't have law degrees, who don't have any legal background. They're just carpenters, teachers, bus drivers, lawyers, whatever, like random. And I don't see a lot of people second guessing that model. I don't see people saying, what? Like, why do we do that? Shouldn't we have trained lawyers or at least people with a master's degree? Like, I don't even see that typical elitism that we so often have for other things. So this idea in BC in 04 was, why don't we take a really complex policy dilemma and ask a group of randomly selected citizens what they would do? Not just throw them in a room, ask them and vote, but actually take them through an elaborate process where for weeks they come in every weekend and they spend hours learning about an issue as a group.
Like an MP would do.
Yeah, exactly. So you're creating a kind of mini temporary legislature of random people, which means right off the bat it's more diverse, right? It's got gender parity. It's got geographic representation. It'll have First Nations, disabled, LGBT, you name it. But also, and this is really important, elections automatically self-select people who are extroverted and incredibly confident to the point where they're bordering on arrogance, right? Like, to put your name on a ballot is a pretty wild thing to do. If you think about what an election is, so each riding in Canada has, like, let's say 100,000 people in it. So you know that there's an election coming up in 2 years, and that this community of 100,000 people is going to pick one person who's going to be like the leader. Think of what kind of personality you need to have say, well, that should be me. I'm going to put my name on the ballot, and then I hope that like tens of thousands of people vote for me because I can do this. I can be the Moses, right? I'm not saying that's a bad personality trait, but it's very specific and very rare. And what that means is that no matter which parties win the seats, you end up with a legislature full of extroverts who all think that they have all the answers and that they're awesome.
Yeah.
Whereas...
And who are reinforced in that belief by the fact that they won.
They won.
And they won again and again and again. Yeah.
Yeah. So, there's a lot of research now and great books being written about introverts and how, one of the reasons they're quieter is because they're actually thinking.
Yeah, I actually did a podcast on a book called Quiet.
Yes, exactly.
Which is one of the ones you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, and my partner is an introvert, and I'm an extrovert, and we've had to learn how to communicate with each other because I always have an answer right away, and I know it's right, and I just blurt it out, and she'll often be quiet in a conversation, and I sometimes interpret that as that she's angry or she's doesn't have anything to say. She's just processing it all, like thinking it through. It's way more humble and thoughtful and intelligent, really. Wouldn't it be great to have legislatures with people like that? But they're not going to, my partner's not running for office. That would be a emotional nightmare for her to have to get in front of audiences and act like a great leader and have the machismo
and yet it's that old adage that the leaders we want are the ones who don't want to be there.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Those are the ones we think are the best leaders.
The cool thing about the Citizens Assembly is that you end up with all these introverts. You end up with extroverts too, but all these different types of people in the room together. And then they get exposed to all these, and they're not coming from parties. Like, no one's whipping their votes. They're just normal people who are listening, learning, and then with a trained facilitator saying, okay, well, now that we've heard all these different voting systems, which one do we think is the best? And they pick one, but then it goes to a referendum. So it's a great hybrid of people power, like decentralized people power, but also deliberative decision-making that is free of both centralized leadership, executive branch, and also free of partisanship and free of the nightmare of hundreds of extroverts in a room, all trying to prove each other wrong, arranged as mobs of extroverts.
Of the 100 remedies that are in Teardown, that's the one that is... That's one of the ones that's the most exciting. And the reason for that is because it seems to solve a lot of other problems if we were to do this, right? If we were to implement a system like this. And I know it's been tried in multiple places before, and I know you've talked a lot about this. But I wonder if we were to implement this, would it be screwed up by over-complexity? Would we try to over-bake it, overcook it? Would we try to work too hard on the rules of how to get selected onto this? I mean, jury duty is pretty simple because most people don't really want to do it, and there's not a lot of power in that. But we're talking about the diffusion of power here, and so I wonder if, that's one. It's not an objection; it's just a question. Like, do you think we could be trusted as people to figure this one out and actually implement it on a large scale and have real power?
Yeah. So there's two ways it could be done. One is that the way we're doing it now, where citizens' assemblies just make recommendations, and it always goes back to either the legislature or it goes back to a popular vote, a referendum. So we're not actually giving them any power at all. We're giving them an opportunity to do that deliberative process so we don't have to learn about all the voting systems. And this is being used on lots of other things too, health policy, let's say a consultation of how to build a new library. It's being used now as a model for lots of policy things, but they don't usually have power.
But for me, what's exciting about it is, what if we gave it real power?
And I do say that in the book. I again, kind of tongue in cheek, but between you and me and anyone who's listening, personally, I think this will be great to try. Just getting rid of elections and actually having legislative bodies that were randomly selected. I don't think we could do much worse than we're doing now. I mean, it would solve so many problems overnight. So political parties, which have become a really toxic part of the whole process, they would have no role anymore. Centralized power and vote whipping is over. Campaign finance reform. I mean, I have a whole chapter on this. How do you deal with the fact that campaigning is expensive, that we have to fundraise either from corporations or when we ban that, still from wealthy people. And then once you're elected, whether it's explicit or not, you kind of owe favors, right, to your donors. And there's been, 150 years of either explicit corruption or just what I call winks and nods, where someone communicates within the realm of legal actions that, I think you owe me something because I was at your fundraiser. Wink, nod. That's gone overnight. We've had a big problem with gender representation in government. We rank 62nd in the world here in Canada with a very low rate of women, and it's actually getting worse. All of our premiers right now, every provincial premier right now is male.
And territorial, 13.
Yeah,
13.
yeah. Well, one territory switched.
Oh, okay.
I think we're at 12 out of 13 now, but all the provinces. That is fixed with these randomly selected groups. Again, instantly.
Yeah.
First Nations representation, Black representation, youth representation,
and
again, introvert representation. All this is instantly fixed.
And it also addresses the question of legitimacy, which we talked about a lot earlier, of, well, how do we trust this thing? Well, of course I trust it. These are people that I know. It could be me.
Yeah.
I mean, we seem to trust juries for the same reason, because it seems to be fair and equitable.
Let me speak directly to the listener here. Whatever your name is, whoever's listening right now, if you were to get a letter in the mail saying, not that you've been selected as a jury member, please report to jury duty, but you've been selected as a member of parliament, please report to Ottawa for the next 5 years, I would trust you. I've never met you. I don't even know your name, but I would trust you with that more than the people who are in there now. And I think you would do a better job. And I think we'd all be better off for it. And what you'd have to do is have people cycling in and out every year. You wouldn't want 338 people showing up, having all never done this before. You'd want some people who've been there for 2 or 3 years, some people just showing up.
And you still have an entire public service in this country and almost any other country who can advise and execute and provide background as they request it, which is exactly what happens in the government today in Ottawa, where you have 338 representatives, but they can call upon the public service to advise them, and they do.
And what we'd end up with is actually incredible stability, because any randomly selected group of 300 Canadians will actually come up with the same ideas, which is why, if you look at our consumer habits, city to city to city, they're kind of similar, because while we're all different in terms of what we buy and what we want, any city of 200,000 people or 1 million people will look a lot like another city of the same size, because in aggregate, we're all very similar.
What's also cool about this is that it's exciting. It's exciting in a way that no other proposal in the mainstream of the political discourse is exciting.
If there's one thing we haven't talked about, it's that none of this is hypothetical, and none of these discussions should be philosophical or academic. I hope anyone who reads my book or is listening to our conversation is going away with the idea that these are actual concrete things that we can and should start experimenting with. But we have to be practical too about how those experiments should start. So, for example, we're not about to get rid of elections federally and randomly select our House of Commons. So if you, the listener, think this idea is cool, as Ben and I do, that random selection is something we should be experimenting with, start asking yourself, where could we experiment with that? And one obvious, huge area to start would be the Senate. They're not elected anyway, so it's not as if we'd be canceling an election. But instead of the Prime Minister getting to choose who they want, we could randomly select the next generation of senators. That would be cool. But
and you wouldn't even need to rewrite the Constitution to do that, because if the Prime Minister agreed to this, he could simply just appoint who is randomly selected.
Yeah, but even more practically, I could see a small town trying this for their school board. I could see high schools, and this is so important. We teach kids from a young age all the wrong things about power and leadership, because high schools elect student councils and for reasons that no one can explain to me, presidents. Why does a high school body need to elect a single person who, again, is going to be a total crazy, overly confident extrovert? It's like the last person who needs any further exposure or training in how to be a leader. We get them to run against each other to be high school president. A much better approach for high school would be to say, we're going to have this group of students who are going to look at ideas for the school, and we're going to randomly select you. Every month, we're going to pick 10 of you. You're going to get together and make decisions. And maybe even don't make it mandatory, but at least it would, you've been invited if you want to be, or have both, right? Again, like I'm always trying, I'm into incremental change because I want to see things happen. Have your student body elect a council because it's in our blood, it's in our heritage, that's what we do. But maybe you elect 5 counselors and even a president, whatever, but then have 4 randomly selected in addition to that. Just to highlight this idea that people who don't self-identify as natural leaders have so much to offer. And then to tie this all back to the one of the topics we were toying with an hour ago, this is the proper manifestation of populism. It's the exact opposite of having cynicism towards each other. This whole idea that we could randomly select people for Parliament or the Senate or a school board or a high school council is the idea that every single student in a high school has the capacity and talent to contribute something unique of value to a council. But the only way you'll tap into that is by having some system where random people are invited to participate, rather than saying, who for whatever reason already feels that you're the best. You are the best in the school. And not only are you the best, but you know that other people will vote for you because they know you're the best. I mean, oh my God, what a terrible, archaic, prehistoric, dangerous model of what power looks like and what decision-making should look like and what leadership looks like.
Yeah, and how do you shake that if that was your upbringing, if that's what you come to know when you're young?
Yeah.
Then the world has to look like that too, because tradition is that very powerful force. Yeah. Dave, thank you so much for taking the time and making democracy exciting and interesting again. It really is. It's a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
Pleasure was mine. Thanks, Ben.
To learn more about Dave Meslin and, for example, find a link to his TED Talk, go to whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can find all previous episodes, as well as a way to get in touch with me. Let me know what guests you'd like to have on this podcast, what things you'd like to have discussed, and you'll also be able to find the show notes for this episode. So that's all the links of the things that we discussed if you want further information. Now, your quote of the week is along the same thread that came up many times in this conversation with Dave, of hopefulness and excitement for what we can do with our democracy. Too often we treat this as a dark and dreary task for realigning how we do things in our politics, rather than seeing it for what it really could be, which is quite exciting. Not only reinvigorating our politics, but designing a government that can do things that are exciting, that are groundbreaking, that move us forward, something that at least most of us can get behind. The quote is from Archibald MacLeish, and it goes, "Democracy is never a thing done. Democracy is always something that a nation must be doing." Thanks, as always, to our composer Andrea Wetstein for providing this wonderful music, and special thanks to the Crosscut Cafe in Toronto for giving us a place and the time to record. Next week, I'm chatting with Ottawa-based disability advocate Helen Rees. I'll see you then.